There is a relationship in the life of every chosen one that is different from all others. It wasn't the longest. It wasn't necessarily the most intimate, but it was the only one that left you feeling like there was less of you than there was before. As if in the end, a part of you had been literally consumed. And the most disturbing thing isn't the pain this relationship caused. It's that you probably still can't explain exactly what happened. It operated by another logic. And this logic has a name. It has an origin. And it has, for the first time in nearly 2,000 years of silence, an architect identifiable by name. I'm not talking about a narcissist. I'm not talking about a toxic person in the sense that modern psychology uses that expression. I'm talking about something more precise and, at the same time, much more ancient. The 2nd century Gnostic texts, the Nag Hammadi codices, the papyri that lay buried in the Egyptian desert for 16 centuries before being discovered in 1945, describe with disconcerting precision a mechanism by which pneumatic souls are intercepted during their incarnation. And a central part of this mechanism is what these texts call an archontic proxy, a physical person of flesh and blood who functions as an operational channel for a specific force. The architect of this specific mechanism, the architect of the relationship that drains, is called in the Nag Hammadi texts Astaphanos. You will understand today exactly what that means, not as a metaphor, not as decorative symbolism, as a functional mechanism documented in texts that have survived 2 millennia. But before we get there, you need to understand something about who you are within the Gnostic system, because the reason why Astaphanos targeted you specifically, and not most of the people around you, is directly linked to the nature of your soul. 2nd century Gnostics did not believe that all human beings were equal in terms of spiritual constitution. This was considered by them one of the most censored truths of the cosmos. The Apocryphon of John, the most complete text of the Nag Hammadi codices, divides humanity into 3 fundamental types. The Helix, souls completely immersed in matter, with no active divine spark, who function entirely within the systems of the demiurge. The psychics, souls who possess some spark but are deeply conditioned by archontic systems. They perceive that there is something more, but they remain trapped in religious, moral, and social systems that were built by the archons themselves to contain them. And the pneumatics, souls who carry the pneuma, the direct breath of the pleroma, the luminous abyss that exists beyond and above the demiurge. If you have made it to this video, you already know which of the 3 categories resonates with what you feel about yourself. Not because I am telling you, but because recognition is precisely the sign. The Gnostics called this gnosis, not an acquired belief, but a recognition of something the soul already knew before incarnating. And now comes the part that changes everything. The Apocryphon of John describes, in paragraphs that rarely appear in popular analyses, that Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, the creator of the material world, created 7 planetary rulers, the archons, each with a specific function of containing pneumatic souls, not generic containment. Specific targeted containment, with different mechanisms for different points of vulnerability. And the 5th of these 7 archons, the 5th in the planetary scheme that the Apocryphon lists with a precision that is almost scientific, is Astaphanos. The name appears in the Greek original as Astaphios, in the Coptic versions of Nag Hammadi as Astaphanos. In some of the manuscripts of the Pistis Sophia, the same being is referenced in contexts that link him specifically to the domain of emotional connections and the draining of life force through interpersonal bonds. And what Astaphanos does, according to these texts, is not create generic suffering. Astaphanos creates bonds, bonds that seem to be the most important you have ever had. Bonds that activate in you a level of care, dedication, and emotional investment that no other relationship has activated. And then, slowly, with a precision that only becomes visible in retrospect, these bonds extract. You will understand the full mechanism in moments. But first, I need to pause here for a second. If what you are hearing is activating a recognition, not just intellectual curiosity, but that specific kind of chill of recognition that the Gnostics called anamnesis, the memory of what the soul already knows. What I am going to share with you next is available in much greater detail. The pneumatic code is a complete guide to identifying, naming, and dissolving the archontic mechanisms operating in your life. The link is in the first pinned comment, available only while this video is up. Click now, access it, and when you are ready, come back here, because we still have the heart of this revelation to reveal. The activation word is pneuma, now, the mechanism. The Apocryphon of John describes the methodology of the archons with a language that, when you translate it literally from Coptic, sounds surprisingly clinical. The text says that the archons do not operate directly on pneumatic souls, because pneumatic souls have a natural protection against direct interference. They need intermediaries. The text uses the Greek term that translates as agent or substitute. In classical Latin, proxy. The proxy is not necessarily an evil person. This is one of the hardest aspects to accept. The proxy is often a genuinely attractive person in some dimension. Intelligent, warm, spiritually curious, with a life story that resonates with yours. The proxy is selected, in the language of the Apocryphon, based on resonance compatibility with the target soul. Because the purpose is not immediate conflict. Immediate conflict does not drain. What drains is prolonged investment, followed by a specific pattern of withdrawal. Here is where the Corpus Hermeticum enters into conversation with Nag Hammadi in a way that very few people have noticed. The Poimandres, the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, likely written in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, describes what happens to the soul as it descends through the 7 planetary spheres before incarnating. In each sphere, the soul acquires a specific quality that will be used by the rulers of that sphere to keep the soul operating within the parameters of the material system. In the 5th sphere, Astephanos' sphere, in the scheme used by the Apocryphon of John, the Poimandres describes that the soul acquires what the Greek text calls epithumia tes apates, the desire to be loved in a way that compensates for an original absence. Translating from ancient Greek precisely, the desire for the love that fixes. And this specific desire, which is not the desire for love in general, but the desire for a particular love that will fill something that seems to have been missing forever, is precisely what Astephanos' proxy is calibrated to activate. You are probably recognizing the person now, or a version of them. It might have been a romantic partner. It might have been a mentor, a close friend, a family member, but when you think of that person and that specific relationship, you recognize the feeling I am describing, that the connection was different, that that person touched something no one else had touched, that for some reason you couldn't articulate, you were willing to give that relationship more than you gave any other. This was not a weakness of yours. It was not naivety. It was not a character flaw. It was a precise activation. The Apocryphon of John uses extraordinarily specific language to describe how the archons, through their proxies, access exactly the points of greatest openness in a pneumatic soul. The Coptic word that the text uses in Codex 2 at Nag Hammadi translates approximately as the entrance that was made for love. The entrance that was made for love. The Gnostics were saying something devastating, that the very capacity to love deeply, which is a defining characteristic of pneumatic souls, not a weakness of theirs, is the access channel, not despite who you are, because of who you are. And there is a second element in this mechanism that the Apocryphon documents with a precision that is almost clinical. The proxy of Astephanos does not drain at a constant rate. He operates in cycles. The text describes a pattern that, when you read it in direct translation from Coptic, sounds disconcertingly familiar to anyone who has been through one of these relationships. Periods of extraordinary intensity and connection, followed by periods of inexplicable withdrawal or emotional coldness, followed by a return to intensity, but a return that always leaves the pneumatic person in a position of having to prove again that they deserved the connection. Modern researchers who have studied cycles of emotionally exhausting relationships describe something very similar using contemporary terminology. But what the 2nd century Gnostics were documenting is that this pattern is not a psychological accident. It is a functional structure with a specific purpose, to keep the pneumatic soul in a state of constant search for approval, which keeps the vital energy, what they called pneuma, the divine breath, circulating within a closed system instead of being directed upward toward the pleroma. You need to understand what this means in the Gnostic cosmological scheme, because that is where the depth of this analysis becomes clear. For the Gnostics, the pneuma is not a metaphor. It is a real substance, the most real of all substances, that exists within the pneumatic soul as a direct deposit from the luminous abyss, from the true God who is above and beyond the demiurge. And the function of the archons, in the system described by the Apocryphon of John, is not simply to cause suffering out of cruelty. It is to keep pneumatic souls consumed enough with the dramas of the material world so that the pneuma never orients itself upward. Because a pneumatic who orients the pneuma upward, who experiences what the Gnostics called anagnorisis, the full recognition of the soul's divine nature, represents what the text calls that which the demiurge fears most, a being that can no longer be contained. And the relationship of Astaphanos is probably the most effective instrument in this arsenal of containment, because it uses precisely what makes pneumatics different: the capacity for intense love, the desire for genuine connection, the willingness to invest deeply. It does not use your weaknesses, it uses your strengths, and that is the signature. But there is something else that needs to be said here, and it is something that superficial analyses of this material usually omit. The proxy of Astaphanos has 5 identifiable signatures in the Gnostic texts, not 4, not 6, 5, and I am going to name each one of them now, because the act of naming, what the Gnostics called onomasia, the sacred power of giving a name, is in itself an act of dissolving archontic power. The first signature. The proxy activates in you a sense of immediate and profound recognition. The Gnostics called this false signosis, a false co-knowledge. It feels as if you have known each other from another life. It feels like that person understands you in a way that other people do not. This is no accident. It is calibration. The second signature, the proxy, creates an investment asymmetry that moves in a single direction. You discover, at the moment of reckoning, sometimes months later, sometimes years, that you were consistently giving more than you were receiving. Not in every dimension. The proxy offers something of real value, but the total balance, when measured honestly, points in one direction. The third signature, the relationship, consistently interferes with your spiritual practice or your inner development. Not necessarily through direct opposition. The proxy rarely says, "Do not develop spiritually." The interference is more subtle, demands on time and emotional energy that coincide precisely with moments of spiritual breakthrough. Crises that manifest exactly when you were about to cross a threshold. The fourth signature, you experience within this relationship a self-doubt that you do not experience in the same way in other contexts, a specific form of questioning your own perception, your own sanity, the very validity of your inner experiences. The Apocryphon of John describes this as the voice of the archon speaking through the mouth of the proxy, and the function of this voice is not direct destruction, but the creation of uncertainty. Because a soul that doubts its own perception cannot orient the pneuma upward, not with enough confidence. The fifth signature, when the relationship ends, in whatever way it ends, you feel not only the pain of loss, but something more specific. You feel that you need to recover something that was left there, that a part of you remained in that relationship. The Gnostics had a technical name for this phenomenon, merismos, the partition. The feeling that you were literally divided during that relationship and that a fragment stayed on the other side. If you recognize 4 or 5 of these signatures in a specific relationship in your life, you are not seeing patterns where none exist. You are reading the text that the Gnostics left as a diagnosis. But there is a 6th dimension of this mechanism that the Nag Hammadi texts address in a specific passage of Codex 13, the manuscript of Allogenes, one of the most esoteric documents in the collection, and it is perhaps the most disturbing of all. The text describes what it calls the trap of archontic compassion. The idea is this: the proxy of Astaphanos, at a certain point in the relationship, presents their own wound. A real or apparent vulnerability that activates in the pneumatic soul not just love, but protective love. The desire to save, to heal, to be present for someone who seems to need you in a way that no one else could. And this triggering of protective love, which is one of the most genuinely beautiful traits of pneumatic souls, this capacity to see the wound of the other and want to remedy it, multiplies the investment of pneuma by a factor that the text describes with an extraordinary image. It says it is like fire that finds oil instead of water. Ordinary love expands naturally and then finds its balance. Protective love, when activated toward an archontic proxy, finds no balance. It keeps expanding because the proxy's wound never heals. Because it is not a real wound that can heal, it is a functional opening that exists to maintain the flow. And the pneumatic soul, without the gnosis of what is happening, invests more, and more, and more, believing that if they give enough, enough will be enough. It won't be. It can't be. Not within the logic of Astephanos. And this is the specific cruelty of this mechanism. It uses precisely your capacity for deepest love, not the easy love, but the love that perseveres, the love that stays when it is difficult, as fuel for the drainage system. And now that the signatures have been named, I need to share with you the part that the Nag Hammadi texts reserve for the end of the revelation about the archons, because what I am going to say next is not comfortable. But it is precisely what differentiates genuine gnosis from spiritual self-deception. You participated, not because you are weak, not because you are foolish, but because the design of the mechanism depends on your participation. The Apocryphon of John is absolutely explicit on this point, in language that modern translators often soften, but which in the original Coptic is direct. Pneumatic souls are not passive victims of the archons. They are active participants in their own containment as long as they do not possess gnosis. What the Gnostics called agnoia, ignorance of one's own divine nature, is not simply an absence of information. It is an active state of cooperation with the system that contains them. This changes everything about how you interpret what happened. Because if you were an active participant, if the desire for the love that fixes was not a weakness implanted in you by the enemy, but a genuine quality of your soul that was instrumentalized, then what you lost in that relationship is not irretrievable. It did not stay on the other side. It can be reintegrated. And the vehicle of reintegration in Gnostic texts is not time. It is not forgetting. It is not forgiveness in the contemporary psychological sense of the term. It is what the Gospel of Truth, another Nag Hammadi text, attributed to Valentinus, the most refined Gnostic of the 2nd century, calls epignosis, the knowledge that returns to the soul what was taken from it through the awareness of how it was taken. You do not recover what you lost by ignoring the mechanism. You recover it by naming the mechanism with enough precision so that the recognition dissolves the bond. This is what the Gnostics meant when they spoke of the liberating power of the name of the archon. Before continuing to what comes next, I want to make sure you have access to the complete material. What I am describing here is just the outline. The pneumatic code goes deep into the structure of each of the 7 archons, the specific mechanisms each one uses, and the Gnostic protocols for identifying and dissolving these mechanisms in your current life. The link is in the first pinned comment, available only while this video is up. The activation word is gnosis. Let us now move to something that is rarely discussed. Why Astephanos specifically? Why not another of the 7 archons? The system of the 7 archons in the Apocryphon of John is not an arbitrary list. Each archon governs a planetary sphere and, through that governance, a specific dimension of the human experience. The first archon, Athoth, governs perverted goodness, the tendency to do good for reasons that strengthen the ego instead of liberating the soul. The second, Harmas, governs perception, the tendency to see the world through the filters of the material system instead of the direct vision of the pneuma, and so on. Astephanos, the fifth, governs the sphere of Venus in the cosmological scheme of the Apocryphon, and the archontic function of Venus, in the Gnostic system, not in the popular astrological sense, is precisely the management of the bond. The force that makes 2 beings attracted to each other, unite and invest in one another. In the system of the pleroma, this force exists in its pure form as what the Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, calls the love that is free because it needs no return. In the system of the demiurge, this same force is captured and inverted into something that constantly needs external confirmation, which places the soul's center of value outside the soul. Astephanos did not create love. Astephanos captured a force that comes from the pleroma and placed it at the service of the containment system. And what this means in practice, what this means in your life, in your specific story, is that the relationship that drained you more than all the others combined was not a failure of judgment on your part. It was the meeting of a real force of yours with a real capture structure that exists at the level of the cosmos. You were not deceived because you are naive. You were intercepted because you are genuine. The Gospel of Philip says this in terms worth quoting directly. In the most faithful translation from Coptic, "He who has the knowledge of the truth is free. The free man does not commit sin. He who commits sin is a slave to sin. The mother of truth is knowledge, and he who does not know the truth is not free." It is not morality, it is mechanics. The slavery of Astephanos is not a punishment, it is a direct consequence of the absence of gnosis regarding the mechanism. And the freedom from Astephanos is not a reward, it is the direct consequence of the presence of gnosis. Now we need to talk about what happens after recognition, because there is a very common mistake people make when they first encounter this framework of understanding, and the Gnostic texts are explicit about this mistake as well. The mistake is using the Gnostic framework to condemn the proxy. The Apocryphon of John is careful, surprisingly careful given the context, to distinguish between the proxy and the archon. The proxy is a human being. The text uses language of being inhabited or utilized, but not identical to the archon. The proxy carries the influence of Astephanos not because they consciously chose to be an archontic instrument, but because, here comes another difficult truth, the proxy is, in most cases, a psychic soul operating within the parameters of the material system without enough awareness to recognize they are being used. The proxy of Astephanos is often suffering as well. Often they are also seeking the love that fixes. The difference is that the proxy seeks this love through mechanisms of capture instead of mechanisms of openness, and the distinction between capture and openness is precisely what Gnosis illuminates. This does not mean you need to maintain the relationship. It does not mean what happened was acceptable. It means that the release you seek is not available on the path of condemning the proxy, because condemnation anchors your attention precisely where Astephanos wants it to be, on the relationship, on the wound, on the drama of what happened. The Tripartite Tractate, another of the great Nag Hammadi texts, likely from the late 3rd century, describes what happens when a pneumatic soul achieves what the text calls apolutrosis, which translates roughly as the release. It is not that the wound disappears, it is that the place where the wound was ceases to be the soul's center of orientation. The soul turns. And the text uses an image that is both very simple and almost unbearably beautiful, like one who was looking down and raised their eyes. Not a dramatic effort, not a violent transformation, just turning the face. And when the face turns, when the attention that was invested in the drama of Astephanos disengages and begins to move in another direction, what the Gnostics describe is not emptiness. It is a fullness that was there all along, waiting for you to stop looking the other way. The Gospel of Thomas, the Nag Hammadi text that many scholars consider closest to the historical words of Jesus, contains a saying that is completely different from anything in the canonical Gospels. Saying number 77 says this, in the original Coptic, "I am the light that is over all of them. I am the all. The all came forth from me, and the all returned to me. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a stone, and you will find me there." The Gnostics interpreted this saying as a statement about where the pleroma is, not above, in the spatial sense, not somewhere else, inside every structure of reality, including you, including what you experienced in the relationship with Astephanos, including the wound and what the wound revealed about the depth of your capacity to love. The wound is real, The drainage was real, the extraction of pneuma was real, and the pneuma is recoverable. Not because you are strong enough to recover it through an effort of will, but because the pneuma, by definition, comes from the pleroma, and the pleroma cannot be permanently diminished. What was taken from you is not mortal substance that can be consumed and destroyed. It is divine substance that was temporarily redirected, and the process of redirecting it back is not a process of conquest. It is a process of stopping, of letting what was being drained simply stop flowing in that direction. Astephanos operates through flow. When the flow stops, the mechanism stops. There is a minor Gnostic text, discovered in the same Nag Hammadi set but much less discussed than the Apocryphon of John or the Gospel of Thomas, called On the Origin of the World. And in this text, there is a description of what happens when an archon loses access to a pneumatic soul it had captured. The language is fascinating. The text says that the archon roars, that he emits something the Coptic calls som, which is a sound not of anger, but of disorientation, as if the loss of access were, for the archon, a kind of sudden blindness. This matters because it is the opposite image of what you probably imagine when you think of breaking free from something powerful. You imagine a battle, a fight, a dramatic overcoming. The Gnostic text says something else. When the pneumatic soul recovers its orientation toward the pleroma, the archon is not defeated in combat. He simply loses the signal. The connection breaks because what he was accessing is no longer accessible. It is not a battle. It is a choice of orientation. And this choice, this turning of the face that the tripartite tractate describes, begins precisely with what you are doing now, with the precise recognition of the mechanism, with the naming of Astephanos, with the understanding that what seemed to be the most important relationship of your life served a function within a system that existed before you incarnated and will continue to exist after you move through this understanding. The relationship did not define what you are. It revealed what you are. It revealed the depth of your desire for genuine love. It revealed that you have enough pneuma to be the target of an archontic mechanism of this precision. It revealed that you carry something worth capturing because only that which has value is captured. The Pistis Sophia, the longest Gnostic text to survive, likely from the late 3rd century of the Common Era, tells the story of a soul named Pistis Sophia who descended from the regions of light, was captured by the archons of darkness, and went through a process of purification that the text describes in extraordinary detail. And it is this song, not the struggle, not the resistance, but the continuation of who she was, even within the capture, that eventually sets her free. The Gnostics were not saying that suffering is good. They were saying something more precise, that the essential nature of a pneumatic soul cannot be permanently altered by what the archons do to it. The suffering of the Astephanos relationship did not change what you are. It tried, and it failed. You are still here, with your pneuma intact in its essence, even if temporarily redirected, with your capacity for genuine love intact, even if wounded. The promise is this, in the original Coptic translated as directly as possible: he who comes to know this will live forever and will not be moved by anything. Will not be moved by anything. Not because they will become insensitive, not because they will stop loving deeply, but because their orientation will be established in something that cannot be captured, drained, or redirected by the systems that operate below the pleroma. Knowledge does not close the heart. Knowledge anchors the heart in something that cannot be taken away. You went through that relationship. You survived it. And you have arrived at this moment, at this video, at this naming, not in spite of having gone through it, but in part because of everything that relationship revealed about what was in you all along. Astephanos has been named. What comes next is yours. If what you heard today opened something you need to go deeper into, if you want the full protocol, the complete structure of the 7 archons, and the dissolution mechanisms that the Gnostic texts document, the pneumatic code is available now. The link is in the first pinned comment, available only while this video is up. The activation word is awakening.